George Bowen woke to the sound of something trying to break into his house. Not a knock, not a tap, a tremendous blow like a sledgehammer striking the cottage walls with enough force to shake the timber frame and rattle every window. He grabbed the kerosene lamp with shaking hands, pulled on his boots. His wife Catherine was already awake, clutching the blankets. The children were crying out from their rooms. Another thunderous impact, this time on the north wall, so violent it felt like the cottage might splinter apart. George ran outside into the freezing April night, lamp held high, ready to confront whoever or whatever was attacking his home. But he found nothing. No one running away across the moonlit fields. No footprints in the frost except his own. No vandals, no animals. Just the empty tableland stretching away in every direction, and the sound of his own heart hammering in his chest. And then, from inside the cottage behind him, it was only the beginning. Welcome to Strewth, where we explore the mysteries that have haunted Australia for generations. I'm your storyteller, Mark, and today we're travelling to the northern tablelands of New South Wales, to a cold April in 1921, when terror came to a family's cottage. When an entire town armed itself against an enemy it couldn't see, and when the line between the living and the dead became dangerously thin. This is the story of the Guyra Poltergeist. To understand what happened at the Bowen cottage, you first need to understand Guyra. 1,000 souls living 1,300 metres above sea level, perched on the northern tablelands where the air bites even in summer and winter frost can kill. It's one of the highest towns in Australia, a place where the land is hard, the winters are brutal, and people tend to their own business. The town itself sits midway between Armadale and Glen Innes, connected to the wider world by a single railway line and telegraph wires that hum in the constant wind. Potato farms stretch across the surrounding tablelands. Stone cottages huddle against the cold, and at night, when the kerosene lamps flicker out one by one, the darkness is absolute. It's a practical place, a no-nonsense kind of place, not the kind of town where people believe in ghost stories. Well, at least before that April in 1921, it wasn't. On the edge of town, just where the streets give way to farmland, stands a small weatherboard cottage. It's unremarkable, the kind of modest home that shelters dozens of farming families across the district. Timber walls, iron roof, a few windows looking out across the fields, nothing special. And this is where the Bowen family lives. George Bowen is a potato farmer, his hands calloused from working the resistant soil of the tablelands. His wife Catherine tends to the home and their children. But this is a blended family, carrying quiet grief in its bones. Catherine's daughter from her first marriage, a girl named May, died just a year ago, and the family's still healing from that loss. Living with them are Catherine's children from that first marriage, including 12-year-old Minnie. If you saw Minnie Bowen in 1921, you might notice her unusual eyes. Dark, introspective, the kind of eyes that seem to look through you rather than at you. She's tall for her age, thin and serious. She doesn't like to smile much. She has a habit of answering questions before they're fully asked, as if she can read the thought behind the words. A curious child, a grieving child, a child who would soon be at the centre of events that defy explanation. But before we meet the Guyra Poltergeist, we need to understand that the town was already on edge, because something strange had happened on April the 1st, 1921. Mrs. Dorr, a local woman, had vanished. She'd been seen leaving town on the Grafton Road, walking away from Guyra with purpose. A witness watched her crest a rise in the road, and then she was gone. Gone as completely as if the tableland had opened up and swallowed her whole. They searched Of course they searched. The entire district turned out, combing the hills and gullies, following every track and farm road. But Mrs. Doran had disappeared as thoroughly as smoke in the wind. So, you see, the town at this time was unsettled, nervous. And then, just days later, on another cold April night, something began at the Bowen cottage that would make Mrs. Doran's disappearance seem like a very simple mystery. After the unexplained thumping the night before, George Bowen had a terrible time the following night trying to convince his wife, and in particular the children, that everything was going to be fine, that it was a one-off. In fact, he had a terrible time trying to convince himself. And unfortunately for the family, things weren't going to be all right. They wouldn't be going back to normal, because the next night, it happened again. But this time it was worse. Instead of thumps on the walls like the previous night, now stones began falling on the roof, not thrown from a distance. These weren't the soft thumps of pebbles landing on iron. These were deliberate impacts, stones that struck with purpose and precision. By the third night, the sounds had moved inside. Sharp bangs on the interior walls, crashes, the cottage shaking from impacts that seemed to come from everywhere and yet nowhere. Windows began to shatter, glass exploding inward without cause, without warning. One window, then another, until nearly every pane of glass in the cottage lay in glittering fragments on the floor. And the stones seemed to target one room in particular, Minnie's room. She'd be lying in bed and stones would crash through a window, landing on her blanket, sometimes striking her. Walnut-sized stones that shouldn't have been able to break through glass with such force. Stones that came from impossible angles. The family began to notice something strange. When they examined the damage, they couldn't determine if the stones were being thrown from inside or outside the house. The trajectory just didn't make sense. The physics didn't add up. And the thumping was sufficient to shake the cottage to its very foundations. So George Bowen did what any practical man would do. He called the police. Constables Stennett and Taylor responded to the cottage. They too were practical men, experienced officers who dealt with their share of domestic disputes, drunken troublemakers and petty crime. They came prepared to find a simple explanation. But what they found instead would break one of them. It didn't take long for the officers to witness it firsthand. Over the next few days, they saw the windows shattering with no visible cause. They saw the stones appearing from nowhere. They saw heavy wooden shutters and battens that George had nailed over the broken windows to protect his family, found smashed and piled on the veranda in the morning, torn free by some tremendous force, all while the family slept. One evening, a pane of glass exploded inward, struck by what appeared to be a pea rifle bullet, but there was no shooter, no rifle crack in the distance. The bullet simply appeared. Word spread through Guyra like frost across a window pane. People began talking, speculating. The newspapers started sending journalists. And with the attention came something dangerous: fear. By mid-April, the Bowen cottage had become the centre of a siege unlike anything the Tablelands had ever seen. 60, 70, 80 armed men. The number grew each night, forming a double cordon around the property. Potato farmers with rifles, shop owners with revolvers, young men looking for adventure and finding terror instead. They stood watch in freezing darkness, determined to catch whoever or whatever was tormenting this family. But the phenomena didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Two large stones struck a wall against which a policeman was standing. He felt the impact through his back, felt the wall shake with the force of it. He spun around, rifle raised, but there was no one there. And the stones, they'd come from inside the wall. The police sergeant assigned to the case sat up night after night in the cottage, 1 yard from Minnie, watching her every movement. He watched the walls, watched the windows, watched for any trick, any sleight of hand that might explain what was happening. But the phenomena persisted under his direct observation, under the surveillance of dozens of armed men. The impossible occurred again and again with no rational explanation. And slowly, inevitably, the sergeant began to break. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. His hands shook. His eyes grew hollow. After enduring the relentless phenomena, witnessing things that violated every law of physics and reason, he was sent away for rest. But before he left, he made his position clear. He was convinced that supernatural agency was at work. But the worst was yet to come. The fear spreading through Guyra wasn't just psychological, it was becoming lethal. People began sleeping with loaded firearms. A woman at Black Mountain, terrified by the stories, bought a revolver for her protection. Her son found it. He was just a boy. He thought it was a toy. And he shot his sister. She survived, but the bullet lodged dangerously close to her brain, too deep to remove. She'd carry that piece of metal inside her skull for the rest of her life. A permanent reminder of how fear can transform ordinary people into walking dangers. Multiple people nearly escaped being shot in similar circumstances. The whole district was on a knife edge, seeing threats in every shadow, hearing menace in every unexplained sound. The New South Wales government couldn't ignore this anymore. The State Police Commissioner sent a team of detectives from Sydney, professional investigators who dealt with every kind of crime and con. They came to expose the hoax, to restore order and to prove that there was a rational explanation. But they found none. Inspector General of Police James Mitchell would later dismiss the entire affair as a joke. But he wasn't there. He didn't stand in that cottage and feel the walls shake. He didn't watch stones materialise from empty air. He didn't see the look in Minnie Bowen's dark, unfathomable eyes. The detectives set elaborate traps. They searched every inch of the cottage and the surrounding property. They interviewed everyone, cross-referenced stories, and looked for inconsistencies. But despite all of this, they still found nothing. And then, on April 18th, a telegram arrived at the Guyra police station. Chief of Police, Guyra, please reserve room, best hotel, arriving to investigate disturbances. H.J. Moores. Harry J. Moores. A personal friend of Robert Louis Stevenson and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself. A trader who'd become wealthy in the South Sea Islands, a man with connections to some of the most famous minds of the era. More importantly, he was a serious investigator of psychic phenomena, someone who approached the supernatural with the rigour of a scientist. If anyone could solve the mystery of the Guyra Poltergeist, it would be Harry Moores. He arrived with no less than 5 assistants and a reputation that preceded him by 1,000 miles. He was no wide-eyed spiritualist, no charlatan looking to profit from tragedy. He was a serious businessman who'd made his fortune through shrewd observation and practical thinking. But he'd also witnessed things in the island, ceremonies, phenomena, that had convinced him the world contained mysteries that science couldn't yet explain. He approached the Bowen cottage like a crime scene, like a puzzle to be solved through systematic investigation. His team carefully removed parts of the roof to check for concealed mechanisms. They examined every floorboard, every wall cavity, every possible hiding place. They set up observation posts at multiple points around the property, ensuring sight lines that would catch any human trickster. They stayed for days. Some accounts say 3, others say up to 2 weeks, documenting, measuring, watching. But the phenomena continued, under their observation and their scrutiny. Moores watched stones strike walls while Minnie was seated behind him, her hands clearly visible. He felt the cottage shake from impacts that had no visible source. He interviewed Minnie extensively. He studied her mannerisms, her responses, her peculiar habit of anticipating questions. He looked for the telltale signs of deception, the micro-expressions, the inconsistencies, the practiced ease of a liar. But what he found was a strange girl, a grieving girl, a girl who seemed as bewildered by the phenomena as everyone else. So after exhausting every possible explanation, Harry Moores made this declaration: "This was a genuine poltergeist." The word poltergeist comes from the German noisy ghost, and it had been used to describe similar cases around the world. Typically, they centred on adolescent children, particularly girls. Unexplained movements of objects, loud noises, violent activity that seemed to feed on stress and trauma. Moores guaranteed his findings. He was so certain that he offered £500, an enormous sum, in 1921, to anyone who could prove the phenomena were caused by human trickery. No one ever claimed that reward, but Moores wasn't the only investigator drawn to Guyra. A spiritualist named Ben Davey travelled from Uralla, bringing with him the promise of communication with the dead. A séance was arranged in the Bowen cottage. The family gathered around a table in the darkened room. Davey began his invocations, calling out to whatever spirits might be haunting this place. He asked questions, waited for responses. The air grew thick with tension and expectation. And then, allegedly, May spoke. May, Minnie's half-sister, who died the previous year. The girl whose death had left such a shadow over this family. According to the accounts, she delivered a message through Davey. "Tell Mother I am perfectly happy where I am, and that your prayers when I was sick brought me where I am, and made me happy. Tell Mother not to worry. I'll watch and guard over you all." Whether you believe May actually spoke that night or not, the séance did have an immediate effect. For a brief period, a few precious days, the phenomena stopped. The Bowens slept through the night without stones crashing through windows, without walls shaking, without the terrible certainty that something impossible was happening in their home. They allowed themselves to hope that it was over once and for all, that May had been heard, had delivered her message, and the family could move on. But hope in this story was premature. The thumping returned, the stones, the crashes, and this time it was worse than before, as if whatever was causing this had been offended by the attempt to communicate, insulted by the suggestion it could be appeased with words and candles and séances. So the Bowens made a desperate decision. They would send Minnie away. Glen Innes is 60 kilometres from Guyra. In 1921, it might as well have been another world. Different town, different people, different homes. Surely whatever was happening at the Bowen cottage would stay there. Surely. Minnie went to stay with family in Glen Innes. Perhaps the change would help her. Perhaps removing her from that cottage would finally break whatever strange connection had formed between a 12-year-old girl and the impossible. For a day, maybe two, it seemed to have worked. And then the walls began to shake. And it was worse in Glen Innes. Confined to Mrs. Shelton's house in a populated street, the phenomena became impossible to ignore or rationalise away. Walls shook hard enough to rattle furniture, and the ornaments, delicate china pieces displayed on the dining room sideboard, kept falling to the floor and shattering. At first, Mrs. Shelton and her neighbours tried to rationalise it. Perhaps someone was throwing stones from outside. Perhaps the thumps against the walls were creating vibrations. Perhaps there was a logical explanation. So they decided to test it. A neighbour, a large man, well over 200 pounds of solid weight, positioned himself next to the sideboard where the ornaments sat. The remaining china pieces had been carefully replaced, lined up in a neat row. "Watch," someone said to the gathered witnesses. The big man threw his full weight against the wall, once, twice, 3 times. The entire house shuddered from the impacts. The floorboards creaked. The windows rattled in their frames. But the ornaments on the sideboard didn't move, not even a tremor. They sat perfectly still, as if the man hadn't touched the wall at all. "You see," the man said, breathing hard from the exertion. "Can't be done. There's no way." The invisible force then struck the wall with its familiar violence. The ornaments flew off the sideboard as if pushed by an unseen hand, shattering on the floor in a cascade of porcelain. The gathered witnesses stared at the broken china, at the wall that had just been struck by something none of them could see or explain, at young Minnie sitting quietly in the corner, her dark eyes watching them all. No one spoke. What was there to say? That evening, while the family sat at dinner, a stone smashed through the dining room window. Glass exploded across the table. The constable who'd been requested to stay in the house immediately searched the property, checked every angle, every possible position a person could throw from. His official report was brief and disturbing. The noises emanated from inside. A neighbour who'd been watching from her own window came forward with an even more unsettling observation. She'd seen a stone fall directly onto the roof, straight down, as if dropped from above. She was certain, absolutely certain, that it was impossible the stone had been thrown from the ground. The phenomena that had terrified, isolated Guyra was now tormenting the middle of Glen Innes. This was no longer a problem for a remote farming family on the edge of town. This was happening in populated streets, witnessed by dozens of respectable townspeople who couldn't rationalise away what they were seeing. The residents of Glen Innes demanded that Minnie leave immediately. She was sent back to Guyra, back to the cottage, back to her family, and the thing that wouldn't let her go. And there, under pressure from Police Sergeant Ridge, 12-year-old Minnie Bowen finally confessed. She admitted to tapping on walls, to throwing some of the stones, small acts of mischief that she claimed were meant to frighten her parents. The confession was exactly what the authorities wanted to hear. Inspector General of Police James Mitchell, who'd never visited Guyra, used it to dismiss the entire case as an elaborate hoax. A clever child playing pranks on gullible country folk. Case closed. But the people who'd been there, who'd stood guard around that cottage night after night, who'd felt the ground shake beneath their feet, who'd watched impossible things occur, they didn't believe Minnie's confession explained everything. How could a 12-year-old girl create thumps violent enough to shake an entire building? How could she remove heavy wooden battens nailed over windows? How could she throw stones while sitting under direct observation, her hands clearly visible? How could she cause phenomena 60 kilometres away in Glen Innes? Harry Moores publicly defended the authenticity of the haunting. The police sergeant who'd broken under the strain never changed his mind about supernatural agency being at work. The dozens of armed men who'd kept watch would tell stories for the rest of their lives about the things that they'd witnessed that couldn't be explained. But officially, the mystery was solved, and Minnie had confessed. And then, just as mysteriously as it had begun, the activity simply stopped. The Bowens brought Minnie back to the cottage, and they waited for the thumping to resume, for stones to crash through windows, for the nightmare to continue, but there was only silence. The Guyra Poltergeist, or whatever it had been, was gone. Minnie Bowen, as we all do, grew up. She married, she left Guyra behind and rarely, if ever, spoke about the events of April 1921. She carried those dark, introspective eyes into adulthood, along with whatever knowledge she had about what really happened in that cottage. Decades later, in 1966, Minnie died under circumstances that echo the tragedy of those early fears. She was found deceased in her home, lying in a pool of blood. The official cause of death was eventually attributed to a brain hemorrhage. She was just 57 years old. She never publicly clarified her confession, never explained how much was truth and how much was said under pressure to make the nightmare stop. The secrets of the Guyra Poltergeist, if she knew them, died with her. If you visit Guyra today, you'll find the house still standing. The Bowen cottage has been enlarged and renovated. The current occupants know the history. They were, understandably, and by their own admission, a little nervous when they first moved in. But there's been no paranormal activity, no stones, no thumping. Whatever happened there exists only in the past, in newspaper archives and local folklore. The local rugby team's called the Guyra Ghosts. There was once a Guyra Ghost Cafe, though it's since closed. And the Historical Museum maintains exhibits about the case, newspaper clippings and artefacts from those strange weeks. Was it a genuine poltergeist? The manifestation of psychokinetic energy centred on a grieving 12-year-old girl dealing with the death of her sister? There are dozens of similar cases documented around the world, particularly focused on adolescent girls experiencing trauma or stress. Was it an elaborate hoax? A remarkably clever child who managed to fool experienced investigators, police officers, and dozens of armed volunteers? If so, she was a prodigy of deception. Was it mass hysteria? A community already nervous from Mrs. Doran's disappearance, primed to believe the impossible, seeing threats where none existed? But that doesn't explain the physical evidence, the broken windows, the damaged property, the phenomena witnessed under controlled conditions. Or was it the perfect storm of all three? Perhaps many did play some pranks. Perhaps the community's fear amplified those events. And perhaps there was also genuinely unexplained phenomena occurring simultaneously. Perhaps the truth is more complex than any single explanation can capture. Paul Cropper, one of the researchers who studied the case extensively, concluded, "My own feeling is that the Guyra haunting was the real thing, and that young Minnie was unconsciously the focus and possibly the source of some genuinely strange events. Unconsciously. That's the word that haunts me. The idea that Minnie herself might not have known what she was doing, that some part of her grief, her trauma, her developing mind might have reached out into the physical world and shaken it like a child shaking a snow globe. Or perhaps it was May. Perhaps grief works both ways. Perhaps the dead can miss the living just as fiercely as the living miss the dead. What we know for certain is that Mrs. Doran was never found, that Minnie took her secrets to the grave, and that the Guyra Poltergeist has been silent for a little bit over a century. But on cold nights in the tablelands, when the wind howls across the potato farms and frost glitters under moonlight, I wonder if anyone in Guyra ever hears it. A faint sound, distant, like someone knocking on a door that no one wants to answer. Strewth. You've been listening to Strewth, exploring the mysteries that haunt Australia's past. If you'd enjoyed this journey into the unknown, please subscribe, like, share the podcast with anyone who appreciates a good mystery. We really appreciate all the support that the show's been getting. And be sure to tune in next week when we head to Gatton in 1898 to examine one of the most mysterious and gruesome cold cases in Australian criminal history. A triple homicide that's never been explained. Until then, sleep well. And if you hear knocking in the night, well, it's probably just the wind. Probably.